Okay, guys, welcome to chapter 2 of The Power of Prayer. Make sure that you are listening for some Easter eggs. I'll try to point them out as I go along, and I'll definitely give you a rundown at the end. So you may have to make sure that you watch all the way through. And if you haven't subscribed, make sure you click the button below. Chapter 2. As the beeping intensified, I threw the alarm across the room to shut it up and pulled the pillow over my head. I had no desire to go to work today. It had been much nicer sitting in the dark yesterday, feeling sorry for myself. Though I could tell myself no one would know, I had little doubt that everyone at work would know by now that I had been stood up. They'd probably be happy. For once, I wanted to curse my braggadocious attitude and constant need to appear superior. If I hadn't made such a big deal about the wedding and invited nearly everyone in the office to it, then I might have been able to pretend the jilting never happened and go on about life. It wasn't like I had close friends at the office anyway, more like associates that I only spoke to between the hours of 9 and 5. But no, I'd had to brag about how amazing it was going to be, and now everyone would know of my humiliation. Sighing, I slammed my palms down on the bed. No, I can't let him win. I have to at least act like it didn't bother me. Besides, they're announcing junior partner this week, and if I don't show up, I'll never get the promotion. Lowering the pillow from my face, I blinked at the intruding sunlight and threw back the covers. With the last reserve of energy, I rolled off the bed and stalked into my closet. A myriad of designer clothing crammed the closet, but I saw none of it. Instead, I yanked on the first black skirt and white top my hands touched. I should have wanted to make a good impression, to prove that I was doing fine, but I couldn't muster the energy. The image staring back at me from the mirror was cringeworthy. Dark patches circled my normally bright green eyes, and they looked dead and void of life. I looked like I'd gotten punched in the face. Better do something about those. It was one thing not to care about my outfit, but I couldn't go in looking shabby and beat up. Grabbing some concealer, I placed a few dots under my eyes and rubbed it in. The look wasn't much better, but it would have to do. I ran a quick brush through my long dark hair that normally flowed in gentle waves, but as I hadn't showered in 2 days, it now hung limp and lifeless. Sighing, I pulled it into a lackluster bun and decided good enough would do, for today at least. I grabbed a quick cup of coffee and a banana and headed to work. The closer I got to work, the more the unease bubbling in my stomach grew. By the time I parked the car and stood outside the building that served as my second home, I had to fight the urge not to turn around, go home, and crawl under my sheets again. Would everyone be talking about me? Would I have to fake my way through looks of pity all day? The very thought sounded worse than a root canal at the dentist. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of courage flickered, and I grabbed a hold of it. Squaring my shoulders, I gripped the door handle to Schuster and Tuck, my firm's office, took a deep breath, and pulled it open. Linda, the receptionist, lifted her hand in a wave and then returned her focus to her phone call. Everyone else seemed engrossed in their tasks as well. Not one eye stared at me. Not one eye stared at me. That could mean no one knew, or that no one cared enough to make a big deal of it. The knot in my stomach untangled slightly, and my shoulders relaxed a smidgen. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. So here's a little Easter egg I didn't mean to plant in there. But you guys just heard me make a noise, like an eat noise. That is something that I do when I'm recording so that I leave myself a mark knowing where I messed up so it's easier to go back and fix. So there you go. There's an Easter egg for you. With my head held high and with deliberate, braver than I felt steps, I covered the distance of the lobby. I was feeling good until I turned down the hallway that led to my desk. And then I sighed. I had spoken too soon. Tina stood at her desk, staring at me with sympathetic dough-brown eyes. Ignoring them, I pulled my shoulders even farther back and marched to the desk. Tina had been my assistant since I first started at the firm a few years ago. And while she was professional, I often found her overly sensitive about things. "Are you sure you're okay?" Tina's voice oozed concern, accentuating her southern drawl. Her voice had often irritated me, and I had worked hard to break my own accent. "We're all so sorry about what happened." Stiffening, I rolled my eyes. "Of course I'm not okay. What kind of question is that? My fiancé left me on our wedding day, for Pete's sake." "Good news sure travels fast," I said instead, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "At least I have more time for work now, right?" Okay, so here's your second Easter egg. When I was in high school, I had a very bad Texas accent because, of course, I'm from Texas, and I ended up having to break it. But it was very interesting the way that my drama coach taught me to break it, and it was by putting a pencil in my mouth and then talking around the pencil, enunciating, overly enunciating, so that it would get rid of the drawl. And now it's actually really hard for me to do a true Texas accent because I worked so hard to break it. Okay, so there is Easter egg number 2. Tina's return smile would have appeared condescending coming from anyone else, but I had known her long enough to know that even with all her faults, one thing she prided herself on was honesty. She held out my messages. "Sure, maybe it will even influence the partner position." Her eyes broke contact with those words, and I knew she didn't believe them, but she was saying them in hopes of making me feel better. I flipped through the messages, my foot tapping against the floor, one of my nervous gestures. "I don't understand it, though. How could I have missed the signs?" Tina's lips pinched together, and she looked down at her lap. "What?" I leaned back, folding my arms across my chest. My lips drew into a tight single line as I waited for her to say the dreaded, "I knew" words. "Well, I never thought it was my place, but Daniel always seemed, what's the word I want? He always seemed too focused." "Too focused? How is that a bad thing?" I thought about my recent past. Sure, I had skipped a few family occasions, but ever since my mother and father had split, they weren't as much fun anyway. My father was always off with his new wife and kids. He had tried for a time to see me on weekends when I was young, but once he married his girlfriend, I had gotten lost in his priorities and rarely seen him after that. My mom had been my best friend growing up, at least until she started going back to church. Now all she ever talked about was what the church was doing and how God was working in her life. I had no time for someone I couldn't see or hear, so our relationship had grown distant. Tina's toe ground into the floor as she mumbled the words, "Well, it seemed like he cared more about his own work than what really matters sometimes." His work? Heat flooded my body, and my hands clenched, crumpling the messages. "It seems he cared even more about my best friend than his work." I paused, mentally forcing myself to calm down and relax my hands. A deep breath completed the outward transformation. Anyway, it's done, and now I have more time to focus on my career. Who needs a man anyway? It's hard to turn the pages when I'm holding the camera with one hand. Tina nodded, timid as a mouse, and returned to her work. I stepped into my office and sat down at the familiar mahogany desk. A mountain of manila folders stared back at me. I drummed my fingers on the desk, hoping the monotony of the familiar would take control. But all I could do was stare at the pile. Thoughts of Shayna and Daniel flooded my mind, constricting my throat and making it difficult to swallow. What were they doing right now? Was she cuddling with him as I used to? Was he nuzzling her neck, finding that sweet spot in between her collarbones and the curve of her throat? The beep of the office phone intercom interrupted my nightmare, and I jumped. "Yes, Tina?" I said, punching the intercom button. "There's a Lexi on the phone for you." Lexi. She was more of an acquaintance than a friend. I had met Lexi in college, but she had always been into partying, which had never fit my perfect plan. Right now, though, letting loose sounded like a nice diversion from the torturous thoughts of Daniel and Shayna. Put her through. "Callie, I'm so sorry about what happened," Lexi began. I ran my hand across my forehead. Maybe this had been a bad idea. Her overly sympathetic tone made her sound like a valley girl, which only increased my irritation. "But I know how to cheer you up. My brother's band is playing downtown tonight. Come with me to hear them. I guarantee you will have a good time." This wasn't the first time Lexi had invited me out. In fact, I was surprised Lexi was still trying, as I never bothered to come up with a good excuse when I turned her down. How many times had I told Lexi I was working late or getting a massage when I was really going home and curling up with a good book, or with Daniel? Ugh. I needed a distraction from Daniel. "Sure, that sounds like fun," I said, pushing the thought of Daniel out of my mind. It actually sounded about as much fun as watching golf on TV, but at least I wouldn't be alone, and it would get Lexi off my back. "Really? I mean, that's great," Lexi stammered in surprise. "Okay, let's meet at the Blue Banjo at 8. "I'll be there." I hung up the phone and rubbed my temples. Would this day ever end? No answer came, and as the mountain of paperwork continued to mock me, I picked up the top folder to begin the tedious research. Junior partner cannot come fast enough. When 5 o'clock rolled around, there were still a few folders on the desk. A week ago, I would have stayed until they were all done, but I had promised to meet Lexi tonight, and surely one more day couldn't hurt. Clicking off the computer and then the light, I enjoyed the blessed darkness for a moment before heading home. Okay, that's not actually the end of chapter 2, but I'm going to stop there for today because I actually have to get some audiobooks recorded as well. So I will put this up. Chapter 2 has 2 Easter eggs, at least chapter 2.1, we'll call it 2.1. And then I will record the next part of it tomorrow, probably, because it's getting late tonight. So hope you guys are having fun listening to this very first book that I wrote. There's some more Easter eggs along the way, but this one had 2. So make sure you've subscribed below, share this with your friends, and come back and catch more of chapter 2 tomorrow. Bye, guys.